where private investment at scale is tricky, so where there's technology risk, where there's development risk, or alternatively, whether it can invest on a subpar basis. So effectively, can it create the kind of terminology is quite often used as catalytic capital in a way that the private sector wouldn't be able to deploy. As I look at Clause 4, it could potentially do those things, and there's no restriction on its ability to do that, but obviously the government hasn't said yet much around exactly what format these investments will take. But that's not necessarily an issue from a legislative perspective. I've looked back at the legislation that underpinned the UK Infrastructure Bank and the Green Investment Bank, which I was involved with when I was in government, and both of those acts are relatively high level in terms of the interventions and the mechanisms that they can deploy. So on the surface, there's nothing that restricts that. I would imagine the government would want to set out, as it thinks about the deployment of Great British Energy, how it gives more clarity to the private market around the sorts of interventions and the mechanisms it will look to deploy at scale.
Is there anything that you feel is missing at the moment from the bill that would provide any clarity, or do you think that it will be covered off in the subsequent documentation?
I think my personal view on the financial assistance space is that it's fine to keep it relatively broad, because having also been a civil servant in government for a long time, primary legislation, if it's relatively broad, gives you the ability to think commercially, and clearly the energy transition is going to be set out with a range of different technologies. Innovation will come through, and the ability for the bill to be flexible will assist that. I think there are maybe other questions around things that are included, referenced less in the bill, let's put it that way. If you look back at some of the previous legislation, for example, that set out the Green Investment Bank, which was in the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act of 2013, the government at that stage talked about the need for operational independence undertakings and a bit more clarity around the importance of creating an independent institution that can act in a way that ensures it can partner with the private sector and take investment decisions that mobilise private investment and don't distort the market. So while that's not necessarily linked to Clause 4, there's some interesting questions around whether the independence framework set out go far enough in the context of giving that reassurance to the private market.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The bill, as we've discussed previously, is pretty sort of light on detail at the moment, which means it could be all things to all people or does not offer enough answers for it to kind of give any reassurance to anyone. From your point of view or from your client's point of view, is there a different mechanism that they would prefer insofar as how would public investment that's being put in this way be used in a different manner, which would actually help drive and retain the private investment which is coming in at the moment? I.e., is this the best mechanism for keeping and driving investment?
On the surface, a range of different countries have publicly owned energy companies of different size and scale. So the concept that private investors are either unfamiliar or concerned at the kind of general level is not. I don't agree with. It'll all come down to your point around the design of the actual institution and how it operates with the private market. I think you're right to say that the bill is relatively high level, and if you look back at some of the precedents that exist, and I mentioned the Green Investment Bank again, that was operational for a number of years and was established and grown whilst then the legislation was taken later down the line. So it was easier if you're a private investor to understand the role the Green Investment Bank will play, and the legislation effectively inform and then solidify that. The challenge, I think, in this context is obviously the government has proceeded with the legislation early on as the institution is being established. Doesn't mean to say it can't be created as an institution that is independent, does galvanise private investment, but clearly the level of uncertainty that currently exists around the design, the mechanisms it will deploy, add to that. And so I think the one thing the government has said alongside the bill is that it will look to publish more detail on a framework agreement with government, how it will obviously set out and consult with private industry, and that in tandem with the bill is really critical at this formation stage. It doesn't mean to say it necessarily needs to all of that detail to be in the bill itself, but it's critical that it goes alongside it.
Josh McAllister.
Thank you, Sir Roger. And it's good to hear you say that the bill has the mechanisms within it to mobilise capital and it's got the full range. And I guess this comes to a recurring theme over the course of the day, which is that the bill should provide flexibility for future eventualities as the energy system changes dynamically. Have you got any reflections on the last 10 years and looking ahead to the next 10 as to how those mechanisms, the ones that get chosen by the executive at GB Energy, may have changed had it been in existence 10 years ago, and looking ahead as well? How might the mechanisms they choose change over time?
It's a very, very fair and good question. I think your substantive point is absolutely right. The mechanisms set out under Clause 4 give Great British Energy the opportunity to take different approaches as technology shifts and changes. You have definitely seen over the course of the last decade a shift towards different mechanisms deployed by government. Early stage, they were largely bilateral, non-competitive, and largely done on a kind of long-term contract basis. It's very instructive to look at what the UK Infrastructure Bank is now doing. It is now looking at different mechanisms, earlier stage investment, development, capital at risk, equity investments. Those are the sorts of things that government hasn't traditionally done at the scale that are necessarily required for the energy transition, but obviously Great British Energy could play a role in extending. I think there is an interesting question around where you draw the line between Great British Energy and the role of other existing institutions. The government has already talked about the fact that it is going to evolve the UK Infrastructure Bank to be the National Wealth Fund, and obviously that will have some crossover with the operations and focus areas of Great British Energy. So for me, and this may be an issue that's separate to the bill, how government sets out how the governance will work between the department and the government and the Great British Energy and the National Wealth Fund and other institutions will be really critical to making that a success over time. Obviously, as the executive of Great British Energy, look at new issues and new technologies as they come through. And I just stress, and I imagine this is made by other witnesses, the fact that the bill under Clause 3 is relatively broad in terms of the sectors and areas that the entity can invest in is really beneficial, because it also allows some level of independence for the executive to take choices as the energy sector evolves, because clearly the number of technologies we have now we know, but there will be a range of different issues that come through. So that flexibility under Clause 3 I think is quite important.
Thank you. Just following on what you were saying about uncertainties, and we've got the bill, but then there are all sorts of other questions, and of course it's all about creating certainties for us as legislators to some extent, but also for investors. So in Clause 5 of the bill at the beginning, the Secretary of State must prepare a statement of strategic priorities. Do you think it would be important to have a timescale for that? That we actually know when the Secretary of State is sort of preparing the strategic priorities, and that it comes quite quickly, because that's something that we can do in this bill, to put a possible time limit or a time frame into this bill.
It's a very good question. I look back at my period of time in as a civil servant. Sometimes timelines can be very useful because they give clarity externally as to when priorities will be updated and when there will be new interventions from government. They also sometimes cannot necessarily reflect the external environment as things change. So I think if there was to be a decision to include an additional requirement around the time frame, you would still want the ability to respond to external events as the world changes, to ensure that the priority set out to the institution can adapt as the external world changes. And obviously that's very true in the energy transition. I think the thing for me on Clause 5 is how, when I look at subsection 8, it references the fact that Great British Energy must have the ability to publish and act in accordance with that statement. The thing for me, and this again maybe not an issue for the bill itself, which will be interesting to watch, will be how bound Great British Energy is to the specifics of the Secretary of State statement and what latitude it has beyond that, because clearly it will want to take its own commercial decisions, and fundamental to its independence and its ability to crowd in private finance will be that it's taking commercial decisions with strong justification. So that's an area where it may not be that it needs any greater clarity in the bill, but it'll be one thing that private investors will be looking at quite closely.
Thank you, Josh. Prior to becoming an MP, I worked globally to advance climate action. So I know there's best practice to learn from countries around the world. As a global corporation, have you seen comparable frameworks in other countries to support the transition?
Completely, and there are plenty of precedents in various different sizes and scale, and actually critically they're not necessarily all in the concept of a developer company, which obviously has got most of the attention as a result of the Great British Energy Bill. There are those examples, and there's significant European energy developers and national energy companies right across the world, and quite often they partner with other entities, whether they're private investors or other developers, and I think it's welcome that in the broader statements government has been clear that especially at an early stage they would want Great British Energy to be partnering with other developers, because we shouldn't forget that we have a lot of leading companies in this country, both kind of headquartered here or also inward investors. The other area that's interesting is the role the state can play more generally, and I think this is sort of, I might be wrong, but this is sort of alluded to under Clause 4. It talks about the fact that the financial assistance may be applied pursuant to a contract, and that's an interesting dynamic because there is a world where, for example, in Denmark, the state, in its new leasing process for offshore wind, is going to take a 20% stake in projects as it offers out contracts to the private sector. And that's an interesting model that could potentially be applied here, and it has been applied in other European jurisdictions. So I'm not entirely sure government's intentions to whether that would be a matter for GB Energy or it would be a matter for broader policy, but clearly it creates different opportunities, and we shouldn't necessarily just think about Great British Energy as an investor of capital. Back to the question asked earlier, this is a significant amount of money, but given the scale of investment that is required, it's going to be about deploying other capital through it, which is the key test of success.
Stephen Flint.
Just answered.
No? Okay. Perrin Moon.
Along similar lines, thank you, Chair. So, thinking about attracting that capital investment, we're currently in a scenario today where, in relation to Clause 4, there's a need to de-risk some UK energy projects to unlock additional capital investment. Can you describe how you see the specific role of GB Energy, in your view, around being able to unlock some of that capital investment?
Yeah, well, I'd look through the kind of project life cycle, and again, Clause 4 gives a lot of flexibility around it. There's the early stage kind of development capital, which is quite difficult at this stage to develop at the scale that's required. Developing large-scale energy projects costs not just tens of millions, but potentially hundreds of millions through the development phase. So there's potentially a role that Great British Energy could play there around deployment of development capital. Potentially more importantly, actually, though, at a development phase, is its ability to help projects de-risk other things they cannot control. So their ability to access a grid connection, their ability to get planning approval, their ability to access the right supply chain domestically, back to the point around unlocking kind of economic potential here. And that could potentially be a significant role for Great British Energy. It'll be interesting, and this slightly comes back to the governance question, where government draws a line between a role for Great British Energy and the government, because a lot of those issues are effectively for the government to deal with, but that's an interesting dynamic to watch. If you kind of move through to the construction phase, I think there's probably slightly less of a role, really, in truth, because the level of capital required in building out projects, once they've got over the initial financing barrier, is potentially lower. The exception, and I know government has talked a lot about this separate to the bill, is around local and community energy projects, where clearly just the barrier to unlocking investment is higher, and potentially there is a role there for Great British Energy, which I know government has talked about. Final piece is kind of the once an asset is being built out and operational, whether Great British Energy should have a role there. I think, again, that's potentially just more of a question as to how you want capital to be deployed. Government could, as I said earlier, take a stake in a project or invest to then seek a return and utilise that money in a way either to reduce energy bills or to reinvest. And that is a kind of question really around just prioritisation of public spending, because that may be a sensible thing to do, but there's a whole range of other things you could invest in which may actually look beyond the energy transition. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel, and the role will definitely change depending on where you are in the asset life cycle.
Pippa Haley.
Thank you. So given your history, civil service and in government over the last years as well, one of the issues around governance under Clause 5 was about sort of the level of scope and power given to the Secretary of State, and without review being able to review, reverse, replace the statement. And given that in the past we've had rolling back of commitments, and what we're trying to do is create certainty for investment, do you have any reflections on whether or not there should be any kind of review that before the Secretary of State could do, given that it's so broad and we're being asked for this to be so broad and flexible that any change would be quite substantive, do you think is there any learning from the past that you would see any kind of change to the way that's described within the bill?
I think there's a question around consultative processes, I suppose. One of the things that we have definitely seen, at least I have experienced, especially in the planning side, is when government sets out statements of intent, for example, through the planning regime, through national policy statements, it is important to consult on those extensively in advance, so there is certainty around what they mean, and then they have kind of weight as institutions then respond. So there's maybe a question around, ahead of the statement of strategic priorities being set out, what level of input is given externally to that statement, or is it just a government statement that is then obviously passed through? So there's an interesting question, I think, around consultation in advance. I suppose once it's established, in truth, the thing that at least those acting and investing alongside Great British Energy that will be more interested in will be how Great British Energy as an institution interprets that statement. And so if they have to set out a strategic business plan as set out under subsection 8, that will be the area that actually the companies will be more interested in, because that will be the, assuming it's an operationally independent thing, that they'll take more seriously. The other dynamic, I suppose, in terms of updates is obviously the risk of kind of regular updates to a strategic plan is that they then create uncertainty. And so maybe slightly back to the question around timeline, having an expectation around when the statement is reviewed, when it's republished, at what stage, and at what needs to change externally to make that a reality is probably an important dynamic. Whether that's a matter for the bill, I'll leave to others to guide on, but obviously it's an area that there'll be a lot of interest in externally and to understanding how Great British Energy actually operates in practice.
Final question, briefly, Andrew Pace.
Thank you so much. So most of my professional background's been in the workforce development and supply chains, ensuring we can deliver on this. So, you know, we've set out, even though we've had the conversation about the flexibility and the broadness of the objectives, I think it's still an ambitious piece of legislation the government's putting forward. So I'm really interested in relation to your reflections on whether it's the objectives or the financial assistance, whether you think within the bill or the country we currently have the supply chain or the skills to be able to deliver on this ambition, or whether actually the bill itself and actually having these powers will help be a catalyst to delivering on that ambition.
I think ultimately the question of supply chain is one that is broader than the subject of kind of this bill. Great British Energy could play a role, absolutely, especially if it's doing place-based investments or it's particularly investing in certain projects. But there is a fundamental question back to the role of government as it looks to build out the supply chain around what it's doing at a skills-based level, what it's doing at kind of technology development level, how it's giving greater clarity on the pipeline of projects over time, some of which may be invested by Great British Energy, some of which may not. And so I think for me, this question of kind of supply chain and skills deployment is a matter of broader government policy of which Great British Energy can support. As we stand here today, we don't necessarily have the right level of skilled capacity in the country to deliver all of the ambitions that have been set out across infrastructure, because it's important not just to look at the energy sector. A lot of these changes will require changes on the transport sector, on the water sector, other issues. But that doesn't mean to say we cannot have those skills if there is a broader framework to develop them, to train, and also to potentially to invest at scale in the supply chain. But I think, for me at least, Great British Energy could play some role in that, but the broader policy framework and the government's ambitions more widely will dictate that to a greater degree.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Buckland. The committee is indebted to you. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Excuse me. May we have the next panel, please? Thank you. We are now going to hear oral evidence from Jack Norquoy, the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at Scottish Renewables, Myrtle Dawes, the CEO of Net Zero Technology Centre, and I hope from Olivia Powis, the Chief Executive of Carbon Capture, although Ms. Powis has been slightly delayed. But we will proceed and hope that she is able to join us later. So for this session we have until 3:50 p.m. and I'd be grateful if, starting with the lady, you could introduce yourselves for the benefit of the record.
Okay, thank you. So my name's Myrtle Dawes. I'm a chemical engineer, and I'm currently CEO at the Net Zero Technology Centre. And just for those of you who don't know, the Net Zero Technology Centre is an organisation which uses government funding to work with industry to actually accelerate and develop emerging technology.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee. I'm Jack Norquoy, representing Scottish Renewables. We are the voice of Scotland's renewable energy industry. We represent nearly 400 organisations working across all renewable energy technologies and the supply chain in Scotland.
Thank you. And from one Scotsman to another, I'll now call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much. So Roger, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today to help in our deliberations on this bill. My first question was actually going to be to Ms Powis, but I will expand on it to Ms Dawes, if you don't mind, to begin with. The Carbon Capture and Storage Association had written to this committee expressing some concern about the definition of technologies in which GB Energy might be able to invest in and work on. They'd like to see an extension of the definition from what has been a set of years of the production, distribution, storage and supply of clean energy to include technologies that might be involved, for example, carbon capture and storage, which is not set out clearly within the bill that is the case. And there's also somebody who works with companies involved in extraction and production from fossil fuels in Aberdeen and that drive to transition to net zero. I wonder if you shared the concern over the narrow prescription in terms of what the GB Energy will be allowed to invest in and be involved in.
Ladies first.
Okay, thank you. So, indeed, I understand their concern. From my perspective, with my reading, I understood that this would be covered under 2B, which was the reduction of greenhouse gases, and fundamentally the storage of or utilisation of CO2 for me comes with this reduction of greenhouse gases. But since Olivia's here, she could probably respond.
Slightly, because we've now been joined by Olivia Powis, who's the Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture Association. Ms Powis, for the benefit of the record and Hansard, could you be very kind and just identify yourself, and then we'll proceed. Shadow Minister may want to come back with part of the question that he was putting earlier, but if you just identify yourself for the record.
Yes, and apologies, I was a couple of minutes late. Olivia Powis, Chief Executive Officer of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association.
We understand the vagaries of travel in London, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Shadow Minister, I beg your pardon. Would you like to come back again?
Was the case once. So Roger, thank you very much. Ms Powis, thank you very much for joining us. I was going to be asking about the concerns that your association have brought to our attention with the definitions within the bill, especially regarding Clause 3 and the objects, and the objects that are restricted to GBE's facilitation and participation in. I wonder if you might expand on those concerns and also expand on your suggested changes to the bill, which you have been so kind to write to us about 2 weeks ago.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I'd be pleased to expand on that. So I think we welcome the bill and we welcome support, and I think particularly in his opening remarks, the Secretary of State during the second reading stating that Great British Energy will support project development to help speed up the rollout of offshore wind and other technologies such as CCUS, wave, tidal and hydrogen. However, we believe that the narrow definition of clean energy provided in the current draft of the bill could be prohibitive to low-carbon technologies and inadvertently limit the scope of GB Energy's investments and thereby reducing the potential for private public projects and hinder the UK's ability to meet its net zero targets. So it's around the definition of clean energy, and I can give you the details in terms of that. So it's clarification on that definition to ensure that it encompasses energy sourced from fossil fuels when combined with carbon capture and storage, so when abated. And we have proposed some alternative wording there alongside with Hydrogen UK, and that's wording that would enable abated fossil fuels to be included within that, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from energy produced from fossil fuels. So it's about ensuring it's future-proofing to make sure that in the future GB Energy would be able to invest in projects such as low-carbon energy with CCS, but to make sure that they can do so safely and wouldn't be at risk of being challenged on that.
Jack Norquoy.
Understand the concerns that have have been raised. Some of our members will also be members of the Carbon Capture Association, so as we're understand those concerns and happy with those, and I suppose our recommendation for the bill and moving forward is that it maintains alignment with ultimately what the Climate Change Committee has within its scope as well as part of our transition to net zero.
Thank you very much. Do you suggest that if we do not make these changes to the bill, that it might be prohibitive to further investment in CCUS, or do you think that the words from the Secretary of State on announcing the bill were enough to calm any jitters in your industry?
No, I think we would recommend that the wording is changed in the bill so that it can future-proof. I think we welcome the words that came alongside it, but to make sure that it's there future-proofed in 5 years' time when people are coming back to this legislation and looking at that it would be on the face of the bill that it is included within that.
Very much. This is a question more to Dawes and then Mr. Norquoy, obviously representing two different types of energy companies. The Net Zero Technology Centre obviously representing companies that are still very much involved in the North Sea, although investing heavily in the next generation of technology that would get us to a cleaner future. How do you see this bill and the creation of GB Energy as a company as helping to facilitate the work that you're undergoing at the Net Zero Technology Centre? And separately to Mr. Norquoy, the same question, how do you see it as assisting the members of your organisation, Scottish Renewables?
Okay, thank you. So I'm really excited about this, and just for reference, the Net Zero Technology Centre received 180 million of government funding, and we've managed to raise and match that with industry, and also go on to have over 100 startups. We've got over 69 commercialised technologies. We've done over 300 projects and gone on to give value back to GB, which is of an order of 1 to 8, 1 to 9 in terms of cost benefit. So for me, when I see something like this, which is of a much bigger scale, so ours is really a microcosm of this, it's really exciting, and also to see something like this, a catalyst sitting at the heart of government, which will really make sure that the issue of the innovation and the support for innovation during that period where it needs the acceleration, where we need this technology to actually make things more efficient, to drive down costs, and actually to get good technology into the next set of infrastructure projects. I think it's super important. So for us, it's really exciting, and I think given what we've seen at NZTC, this could go on to deliver quite a lot of value.
I will share that enthusiasm. Scottish Renewables has welcomed the development of GB Energy alongside many of our members within industry. We, of course, welcome any additional investment at this time, particularly when we have heightened ambitions towards 2030. But we have an unprecedented line of sight in Scotland with our pipeline, so we welcome the conversation and the development of GB Energy in terms of delivering the support that will be needed to accelerate deployment. I suppose for us, we are particularly interested to see what the goals are of GB Energy. That has been set out as part of the bill, but also some of the surrounding documents as well. We will need to see some clearer objectives and pathways to support that too with industry. We appreciate that may be something that comes after the bill. We have interest in the governance too. It's been discussed at committee so far today, the importance of the operational independence, but whilst finance is very important towards heightened ambitions, as GB Energy will do as set out in the bill, finance is important, but we also want GB Energy to work with industry as well. And this comes at a time when there are a lot of moving parts within industry, welcome moving parts. We have the development of a strategic spatial energy plan, National Wealth Fund, GB Energy. So we will like to see, we welcome the bill, the establishment of GB Energy, but in the steps ahead, we would like to see that pathway to give some assurance to our members within industry who are actively involved within the pipeline now, and how they can help towards the deployment to 2030.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. For my last question, Chair, I promise this is specifically to Mr. Norquoy. You represent Scottish Renewables, and obviously there have been at times in the past, moments where the aims and objectives of the UK government and the Scottish government have not been entirely aligned. Your members obviously operate in a devolved administrative area, Scotland. How content are you with the provisions within this bill that GB Energy, which is obviously an arm of the UK government, a company established by the UK government and answerable to the UK Secretary of State, will have the autonomy and the power to work within the auspices and constructively with the devolved administration in Edinburgh?
So there is within the bill obviously the reference to working with Scottish ministers, which is welcome, part at the moment of improved relations, which is welcome too. In terms of the topic of governance and devolved competency, one thing that we are looking at in particular is, of course, as we heard in earlier evidence from the Crown Estate, the partnership with GB Energy is welcome. There will have to be development across the UK to support our net zero targets, but we want to ensure that there is parity with Crown Estate Scotland too. I highlighted at the start the pipeline that we have sitting in Scotland. So on that point, in terms of the competency of the Scottish Government, we would like to see some more detail, again, probably out with the bill, in terms of how we can ensure parity between extra powers to the Crown Estate and to Crown Estate Scotland.
Stephen Flint.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard a great deal today, and rightly so, about the potential investments that GB Energy could make, whether that's production or storage or generation, and so on and so forth. I'm particularly interested in the innovation space, and certainly from your own experience with regards to the Net Zero Technology Centre. Do you think that GB Energy's focus perhaps should be driven towards that, given the relatively small quantum which is available, or do you think it should be broader and more focused on the de-risking of projects which are perhaps already in the pipeline but would require that assistance that might exist in relation to consenting or planning, or indeed further capital investment?
So I suppose I suppose it would have to be towards impact. Naturally, I think something like the budget we're looking at is really well suited for innovation. I think the amount of a crowding in of money that you could get around that from investors, and actually the impact you can have by really moving on a lot of projects is quite significant. If I just take an example of something like floating offshore wind, we've got some of the best wind resources really in Europe and actually the world. And, we are sitting with one of the best supply chains for subsea in the world, and that's because the North Sea has been the harshest place in the world to actually do business. So if we're ever going to get, I would say, an effective floating wind business with technology and jobs here in the UK, we would need to start and move on that now. And the opportunity from that is that not only do we get electricity here in the UK, but we are very close to the heartland of Europe, who also are looking for electricity and they're looking for hydrogen. So there are lots of things that we can do where the impact, if we were to move now, would be great. I mean, I've also worked on major projects in terms of de-risking. They do need de-risking. I don't think that the supply chain are necessarily looking for a handout. I think they're looking for clarity. They're looking for investable business cases. They're looking for things where they can do the commercial work that they normally do. And I can tell you, At the heart of this is technology, which has to be sufficiently robust and reliable and actually cheap enough so that actually the product is cheap for the customer. In this case, it's those who are using our energy.
Any further contributions before I go back to Mr. Flynn, if he wants?
I think I would just support everything that that has been said there, and I think the GB Energy offers the potential for targeted investment and support in areas of the value chain, and so for new innovations and across the supply chain. Particularly, we look at some capture technologies that are lower TRL levels that would really benefit from some investment here, and enable them to move forward, what we refer to as the valley of death, to be able to then compete on that open market. So there are many opportunities, I think, within the innovation space.
Mr. Norquoy?
I think it's a big part of what GB Energy will do is the local power plan, in which a sizable contribution of that 8 billion allocation has been made. So you raised the point about how the rest of it is spent, and share the comments that have been made on innovation. I think there will be a need for GB Energy to have a balance, and I think that has been outlined in what we've seen so far, in that there will need to be to generate revenue in order for a public return. But I think it's important that that money as well is targeted at some of those high-risk areas where you need that longer strategic term view to support the innovation. You look at sectors in Scotland such as the marine energy sector, I think would very much welcome some of that targeted support. So you have a balance between GB Energy being willing to take more risk than perhaps we have seen so far, but you also have some investment going towards, perhaps as part of that local power plan, developing that stable revenue that you will want to see come through as well.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I just have two questions for Ms. Powis, if that's okay. The first one is just going back to the definition. I was interested in what you were saying, and I just wondered, before you arrived, Ms. Dawes mentioned that she felt that it was covered in 2B. Can I ask why you don't think that that sentence is sufficient to cover CCUS?
I mean, what we have proposed instead is that the statement must provide that Great British Energy's objects are restricted to facilitating, encouraging investment in and participating in one or more of the production, distribution, storage and supply of clean energy, and then the reduction directly or indirectly of greenhouse gas emissions from energy derived from fossil fuels, and where that clean energy definition means energy and molecules produced from sources other than unabated fossil fuels. So I think it's just about being clear in terms of that clean energy definition, which I think we are concerned that would be could be interpreted in the way that it's currently drafted, or we have been told that in the way that it's currently drafted would exclude those with fossil fuels.
And just on CCUS, like, where obviously we want Great British Energy, once it's established, to have that broader portfolio. Lots of witnesses today have said that. Where would you place CCUS in that risky to non-risky kind of investment for that 1.6 billion?
CCUS as an industry, I think we very much welcome the announcements from government last week and further detail yesterday. So there is investment, lots of private sector investment in these projects, helping them drive forward, and the funding commitment from government is for projects once operational. Obviously, there are still first-of-a-kind projects here, and so I think I wouldn't classify it as a very high risk. This is not a new technology. It's an industry that's been deployed elsewhere, and there's understanding in terms of how it will work. There will be first-of-a-kind projects in the UK and therefore there could be areas in which GB Energy could play a critical role there, perhaps in, and I think we're yet to really explore the extent to which that can be, but would welcome much further discussion on that. But there could be a role in terms of enabling infrastructure, oversizing pipes, etc. So ensuring, in import terminals and port infrastructure. So I think there is a role there that it could play in terms of really driving forward that enabling infrastructure investment.
Mr. Dawes, Mr. Norquoy, do you want to add anything to that?
So I'm glad to get the clarification. I would say we also invest in CCUS. I think it's really important technology. I think firstly for the industrial decarbonisation. As an engineer, I'll tell you there is risk involved in that because we're used to steady state and we're going to want to stop and start things, and it's a refrigerant, so it won't like it. So I think there is quite a lot to do. In terms of reducing costs. I think the monitoring and verification of the stores is super important. And I do agree, and I think if we can turn what is a waste stream, which is going to store, into a product stream which is being utilised, that would be fantastic. I mean, that has to be the way that we need to go. But lots of technology, I think, both on the capture of the emissions, direct air capture, which I think has its role, especially if we're going to be looking at some kind of synthetic fuels. And I think also some of the emerging technologies around capturing CO2 from seawater, apart from the fact that we might be able to mine some minerals from doing that as well, are things that we should be looking at, because it's all about getting that security of doing these things close to home.
Pippa Halings.
Yeah, so Mr. Norquoy, in your opening remarks, you were saying that there is sort of businesses would like a little bit more assurance, and perhaps that would come out in the Secretary of State's statement and the strategic priorities. But you did mention around the objects, and this is part of the committee's debate at the moment, is how wide we make the objects. Mm-hmm. If you thought there should be any objects included, because it seemed to be indicated that might be beneficial, what would that be? Because you said, well, we're ready to wait, but actually there's some sort of... Yeah.
Happy to clarify it on that. So I think we are content with the bill. We understand the need to enable that flexibility so that it can evolve over time. We certainly want GB Energy to be something which is durable at a time that we are building a new energy system. The various mechanisms that I highlighted at the start, this is an opportune time for this to enable that durability. So I think the scope is right, and yes, it is a wide scope, but that I think is important for the longevity. The point on clarity that you ask is we would want to see within that business plan and as part of the statements that will come thereafter following the bill. Very keen, I think industry is very keen. We are operating at pace, so we do want some clarity around the perhaps architecture in which this will be sat in, to give some assurance to businesses who are ready to engage, continue to want to work very closely with the government and GB Energy, but to get a sense, and it's been highlighted in the committee to date so far, in terms of where is the role of GB Energy, where does that end when it comes to the National Wealth Fund, where can that complement each other, as well as the established array of institutions that we have at a UK level, primarily the UK Infrastructure Bank, but as well that is compounded when you come to Scotland as well, because we have the good work of Scottish National Investment Bank, Scottish Enterprise, so some of that architecture, I don't think that detail is needed within the bill, but would be very welcome shortly thereafter.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel wish to respond? No. Any further questions? If there are no further questions of this panel, then, ladies and gentlemen, may I thank you very much indeed for your evidence. I'm very grateful to you for coming in.
I'm sorry. In the business case. Which is why I think that we've amended.
If allows, I'm definitely up for schools.
Yeah, I mean, you know, kids who can't.
Yeah, I know.
Like keeps on leaving. Cleverly through, so.
I'm pausing slightly just to allow members to settle and make sure that we've got all the things that we need for the moment. We're now going to take oral evidence from David Whitehouse, who's the Chief Executive of Offshore Energies UK. And for this session, we have until 4:10. Mr. Whitehouse, for the benefit of the record, could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, I am David Whitehouse. I'm the Chief Executive of Offshore Energies UK.
Thank you. Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger, and thank you very much, Mr. Whitehouse, for joining us this afternoon. I think it's fair to say that OE UK have been somewhat sceptical, though obviously wanting to work with the government regarding the overarching policies towards the energy sector, specifically the sector that you represent. But speaking specifically to this bill and the establishment of Great British Energy, how do you see that company interacting with members of OE UK in delivering what we all want to achieve, which is greater energy security and a drive towards a cleaner net zero future?
Thank you. So actually, if I look at the 400 members that we represent, those are people who are investing in oil and gas, in developers, in wind developers, in carbon storage, but actually also a huge supply chain. I don't think we're sceptical. I think as an organisation and those 400 members and the 200,000 people who work in the sector, we see that journey to net zero as a real opportunity for the UK, a real opportunity for Scotland. We see it as a real opportunity if we build on our industrial strengths. We are so lucky in this country that we have brilliant people, we have a world-class supply chain, and we're lucky that the wind blows and we have the North Sea and other assets. We must make best use of it. So within the context of a wider energy strategy, we absolutely welcome GB Energy. GB Energy will play a role in a bigger energy strategy, in a bigger industrial strategy. How would we see it working? We would see GB Energy unlocking opportunities that otherwise would not happen. The GB Energy will not create value if it simply replicates what private sector would do anyway, and I think that will be acknowledged in the priorities I would expect to see from the Secretary of State. But there is still a huge role in de-risking projects. I think there's a huge role that can be played in actually some of the local energy projects that are raised. I think there's a huge opportunity investing in technology and future infrastructure. We touched on infrastructure with our European neighbours. And how do we interact with it? Already we have a number of companies looking at what are the kind of projects which meet the mandate of GB Energy that would fulfil it. Don't forget that world-class supply chain that we have. We will fail in this country if we don't recognise how important our supply chain is, and the oil and gas supply chain we have is world-class. The transferability of those skills to what GB Energy needs to deliver is huge. There is a massive appetite for us to leverage the skills that we have and use GB Energy as a vehicle to deliver value for the country.
And do you think this bill will do that, Mr. White?
I think what you have, is a bill. I think it is a. I think you've heard evidence. I think the bill provides broad definitions, broad statements of intent. So in of itself, it is a platform to deliver that. I think what is going to be critical is that the government, the Secretary of State, and actually the devolved governments who have welcomed this, work together and honour the words about working in partnership with industry to take what is on paper and turn it into that reality of unlocking opportunities that wouldn't be happening, unlocking opportunities for actually communities up and down the UK, and certainly our key supply chain companies, and help us accelerate some of the critical projects that need to be unlocked.
Is there some concern? We had the CCA before us a few minutes ago, Mr. Whitehouse, and there was some concern from their members that the objects, clause 3, part 2, stating that GB Energy's objects are restricted to facilitating the production, distribution, storage, and supply of clean energy, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, improvements in energy efficiency, and measures for ensuring the security of supply of energy. Is there any concern from within your members that this will prevent GB Energy being able to partner with or invest in some of those companies, given that they have already an existing footprint within the oil and gas sector, which they would be prevented from as a result of the objects as stated here?
So I think we will look to bring clarity in that particular area. The interpretation we have taken and the conversations we have had is this would not preclude companies investing in that manner. The interpretation and the conversations we've had says that those investing in that actually the bill is defined broadly to allow all companies to invest, and that's something we very much welcome. On the journey to net zero, we see it as being one of inclusivity, not exclusivity. So as I've said, we represent companies who produce oil and gas. That has a critical role in our energy mix, absolutely. But in terms of bringing forward technology as it stands, no, we don't. There is, I think, an opportunity, though, as the Secretary of State brings forward the priorities, to provide clarity that those things would not be excluded.
I think one last question, if you beg your patience, Sir Roger. Obviously, a lot of your members represented in Aberdeen. The very first evidence this morning we heard was from Mr. Meyer, Jürgen Meyer, who is the new chair of GB Energy, announced obviously that the headquarters of GB Energy established by this bill will be in Aberdeen. How important do you think that is, given the links that will have to be established between the existing energy sector? You mentioned the importance of the supply chain, success of GB Energy moving forward, and how do you think the geographical location of that headquarters is to the future success of the company and indeed the energy sector in the UK?
Position we've always taken is actually you have energy communities up and down the country, up and down the UK, and actually we have a very proud energy sector, and in principle I think you could have put GB Energy in many places, but we welcome it in Aberdeen, and the reason we welcome it in Aberdeen is because that is where you see that real density of high quality operators, high quality developers, and high quality supply chain. Right place to put it. And I think as well, we take confidence that on this journey to net zero, it must be about inclusivity. It must be breaking down barriers and building bridges. And actually having it centred in Aberdeen, I think, is a good statement of intent that I think this government, and it was supported by the Scottish government, recognise that as well. We need to make the most of our industrial strength. Placing this in Aberdeen, I think, is a good statement of intent, so we welcome that.
Thank you, Sir Roger.
Torkel Crichton.
Mr. Whitehouse, I hear what you say about this bill and GB Energy being an opportunity, but when I hear from some of your members, they think renewables are a threat. So how can we change that language around and to protect that world-class supply chain? What can the industry do and what can GB Energy do to ensure that the supply chain and the jobs stay here?
Apologies, what was the word they were using about the...
A threat. There's something that sees it as a threat.
Oh.
Not an opportunity.
So I think, I tell you, I need to do a better job because I don't see a threat whatsoever. In the UK at the moment, we're on a journey. The Climate Change Committee says we must hit our net zero targets by 2050. On that journey, 50% of our energy under the balanced pathway is going to come from oil and gas. Today we produce about half of what we need, so I think it is right, in my opinion, if the industry is held to account, we should prioritise domestic oil and gas, and currently we only produce half of what we need. Our members see no threat from accelerating the path on renewable energy. It is going to take time, but absolutely it is the right thing to do, and I guess the only concern or consideration from our perspective is, yes, of course, accelerate. And actually our members are investing in that, and our supply chain members are using their revenues from oil and gas to invest in that transition. It is an opportunity, not a threat. I think what we need, though, is that balanced discussion, where those who work in the oil and gas sector, we have a voice in, we are Offshore Energy's UK. We are not Oil and Gas UK, and that is because companies are evolving, supply chains are evolving, people are evolving, and you want that big tent. If we're going to be successful, bring it forward. And so if you are getting that feedback from those in the sector, I hope that in the coming weeks and months you will not hear that.
Thank you. Any further? Beg your pardon. Stephen Flint.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Whitehouse. In terms of, back to GB Energy itself, in terms on the bill that's in front of us, in terms of the opportunities which exist, for your members, would their appetite for projects that are related to production or generation of net zero energy, is that going to be increased by the quantum which is available as part of GB Energy, which is in real terms relatively small, £1.3 billion per year, less the money that's already likely to be allocated to local plans and community projects, or is it the ability to de-risk? And if it's the latter, can you perhaps expand upon your earlier answer?
So what I would say is, I think we all recognise, Journey to Net Zero, Climate Change Committee, £1.4 trillion required. So there's huge amount of investment required to get us there. The lion's share is going to come from the private sector, and so if I could say GB Energy is not going to play it. GB Energy will help, but actually we need to create more broadly the conditions where we have investment in the energy sector, where we have investment that turns into enduring value. That's what we need to deliver, and we can talk about that. Where GB Energy plays a role, though, I think it is those opportunities that otherwise would not have happened. And so in terms of the opportunity to de-risk projects, I think it can play a role. So we look at things like carbon storage. I think actually de-risking and understanding the nature of the carbon stores and then using that as an opportunity to buy into future investments, I think is a role that GB Energy can and I think should play. I think we've spoken about connectivity with Europe. I think Scotland and the UK's future will be hydrogen pipelines to Europe. I think there is a role for a state player to crowd in private sector to money in order to make those projects happen. But if I could say, one of the things, often we talk about GB Energy as an investment vehicle. It should, if we work in partnership with industry, should be so much more than that. Getting money actually is difficult, but it's not usually always the most difficult thing that we have to do. It is unblocking the other issues. 13 years from consent to delivery of first electrons. It is those areas where having a state player who is sitting with industry, who understands our challenges, understands what we need to do. That's where GB Energy, often we talk about it as an investment vehicle. It should have a bigger vision than that.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once. Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Section 5 of the bill, of the Statement of Strategic Priorities, obviously doesn't have a timescale on it. And I wondered from your members' point of views, how important is that timescale is narrowed down, particularly in mind of a lot of your members will be international companies and obviously investment and personnel, i.e. skills flow abroad, and we can't be guaranteed that they're going to wait for a strategic priorities document to come forward.
There is no doubt that the UK and Scotland we're in a global race for investment, and we need to create the environment where we are attracting investment. I sit in a sector which has been battered to some degree by public perception, also tax changes. There are things that are happening out with GB Energy that I think, as a country, we need to look at. We need to make a great environment for investment. But time does matter. So I think absolutely. I think where GB Energy will start to come to life is when the Secretary of State puts forward priorities. And the thing that we would ask, and I think you've heard it from others, is bringing forward the strategic priorities for GB Energy. It should be something which we should be engaged in now, and it's bringing forward now, and it should come forward in a timely manner. But it must make sure that it has taken on board the necessary engagement with industry, with governments, and other key stakeholders. So time is always of the essence.
Perrin Moon.
Roger. Mr. Whitehouse, you mentioned earlier in relation to Clause 4, the financial assistance, the unlocking of capital investment. Can you elaborate on specific areas where de-risking of unlocking capital investment could be particularly relevant to GB Energy?
So for me, there's areas, touched on them slightly, but there's areas now where you look at projects, you look at a project timeline. Actually, if you have more data up front, more information up front, it massively shrinks the time from taking on a license or whatever it is and turning that into carbon stored or electricity generated. I do think that there's an opportunity for an entity like GB Energy to invest in some of that upfront data gathering. It de-risks those projects, and GB Energy would then have the opportunity to trade that for a share in future projects that come from that. So I think there's it is something again to see how that shows in the priorities, but I think there is a very clear area where GB Energy can invest now to get data and use that to leverage equity stakes in projects moving forward, which I think is very much consistent with the founding principles of GB Energy. And we touched on it as well. I also see there's infrastructure required in the UK. Much of that is now being dealt with through NESO, and people will have spoken at length about issues around grid. There is so much more we need to deliver a net zero future for the UK and for Europe. And again, a state investor with a long-term investment horizon, I think, can now be in the position where we do start talking about what are the networks we need across the North Sea in order to be successful, and having an entity like GB Energy crowding in private sector money, I think, is a great opportunity to unlock some of that.
Yes.
Just in relation to that and relating to clause 3, you mentioned the supply chain, and I totally agree with you, the value of the UK supply chain. You referenced the North Sea quite a lot in relation to that, and I completely understand that with your membership. But what about the other areas of the UK, particularly I'm thinking of Wales and Cornwall, where there's a huge renewable energy opportunity, but perhaps the supply chains haven't yet been as well established as they are in the North Sea. Could you comment on how we fix that problem through GB Energy?
So if I could, I think it should be one of the I think it will be, and it should be one of the priorities of GB Energy. Is in our drive for clean energy. It must be done in a way where we create those supply chains. How do we do that? We already, I think, so we can provide it to the committee. We have a good assessment of the quality of the UK supply chain and what its capabilities are. I think we have a good understanding of what those future renewable opportunities are. And you're absolutely right. So there are supply chain opportunities across the country, in essentially every constituency in the country. So we have that knowledge. Now what we need is GB Energy recognising what those opportunities are, recognising, I think, I think there will be projects to be invested in that GB Energy should be part of, and it should be directing and working with industry and the supply chain to make sure we take the opportunities to grow our supply chain. We have a lot of very significant companies which I think we should grow. It's a fantastic export, but also delivers on our own. Myrtle will have touched on it. We have a whole host of acorns around this country that could be grown into massive oaks, and that should be one of they probably use less flowery language, but that should be one of the principles of GB Energy. We have supply chain acorns, and we can identify them. We must turn those into the oaks that this country needs.
Thank you, Chair. We have been sort of through these houses several times today about this is the bill in front of us that we really need to sort of see whether we could add anything, whether something is missing, or whether a lot of this will become clearer once the Secretary of State prepares the statement of strategic priorities, or we understand the governance structures, all of that. What you're identifying is all the stuff, of future development of technologies that we don't even know about. And the question this morning was also, should there be something in the bill that specifies that GB Energy should particularly look at that gap, also in the gap in financial markets, to support the valleys of death of these sort of new technology companies that just don't make it over the line, and that there are not enough, as I understand it, enough financial products out there that are currently provided by either private equity, or the other investment, or ordinary banks, or the other investment opportunities. Is there anything in the bill where we can put that in order to make that particular gap, give it more priority?
I'm sorry, I wish I could give you a better answer, but the answer, so speaking with our members, in some way, shape or form, we think the bill as it stands is broad, and actually it does then provide the opportunity for the Secretary of State and others to bring forward the statement of principles, and I think that's where we would see some of that. I think also government will bring forward an industrial strategy, and linked to that will be our energy policy. I think there's such a good opportunity within those that we have representation from industry who understand some of the issues, representative from our investors across the sector. I think that from our members' feedback, that is where they would see that input in those broader...
This bill.
Not this bill, sorry.
Catherine Fuchs.
Sir Gale, I should say. Mr. Whitehouse, you mentioned inclusivity, and I think you were referring to devolution there, and including the different governments in the UK. But what I'm interested in terms of skills and inclusivity, is the important work of getting more women and a greater diversity of people into this sector. I was really pleased to see Ms. Dawes and Ms. Powis give evidence earlier, and I purposefully didn't ask them the question, the two women in the room, how we can get more women into this sector. But how can we make sure that in the strategic plan, I hope this is in the scope, because this is 8A, in the strategic plan, how can we get into the strategic plan for Great British Energy greater inclusivity and diversity in this sector?
Yeah, absolutely. When I talk about inclusivity, we talk about that in general terms. There is a I'm studying for my Master in Renewables. I am the energy transition, albeit in a slightly older. When sometimes we talk about inclusivity, those who come from oil and gas heritage are sometimes excluded from the conversation. So sometimes when I talk about that, it is those, you need all those voices. And that when I talk about inclusivity, it is bring all the voices. How do we improve what we're doing? So a couple of very brief comments. One of the best, speaking probably personally, I thought an excellent piece of legislation was to bring forward gender pay gap. Because it may, in of itself, what does it do? It makes conversations happen. It makes debates happen. In this sector, we sat last week and we spoke about Vision 2030, about how we as a sector are going to how we are going to deliver on a sector which is truly inclusive, that actually looks like the future, not the past, that is attracting the next generation, and commitments about targets that we wish to attend. And on that path, 7 pillars in terms of how we get there. So how do we do that? I think you need commitment from leaders within the sector. I think we can give you that. I think you need to have some targets. I think we can give you that, and I think we need a plan of action that follows it and hold us account to do it. And the reason why we do it, if we come back to this path to net zero, we will not do this if we're not inclusive. We will not do it if we're not attracting across the entire spectrum, the entire country.
I think we can say that was fairly close to being outside the scope of the bill. I'm absolutely confident that the next question will be within the scope of the bill. Uma Kumran.
Roger, I'll do my best. Thank you, David, for your insights today. You talked earlier about the potential for GB Energy to be so much more than an investment vehicle. In your opinion, what are the other barriers that GB Energy and the government can break down to create an environment to accelerate the transition?
So I'm an engineer, so simple engineering stuff. The collaboration. So we've spoken about. So I was pleased to see Scottish Government also and the devolved governments welcome it. I don't think GB Energy in of itself is the convening force, but that convening power that we have governments around this country working together for a common goal. I think that's an important part of what GB Energy can provide a focus for. Collaboration is really important. We need collaboration amongst our regulators. We have a complex regulatory framework. The view many of our members would take is actually to change our regulatory framework to be exactly what we require for this journey will take so long, we'll have missed the train will have gone. But what GB Energy will do and see and help is alignment between our regulatory bodies, and that's bodies both in the devolved governments and wider UK. So that piece. And then what I think it will also see is what are the other real barriers to investment. So collaboration, looking for, to be honest, I think there's good cross-party consensus about the journey we need to go on to drive that. And then what needs to be done to help with a very simple coordination between different competing projects. I think that can drive down costs, that can drive efficiency. What can we do to reduce the cycle time? And again, from 15 years from licence to electricity, or unfortunately, in my experience, I think I'm on to about probably year 30 from carbon storage to actually injecting it. And I think there's a significant role that GB Energy should be growing into and playing in that space.
I apologise. We at this end of the table, and the reason for the slight distraction is we've been trying to juggle timings in connection with the division that is imminent, but not quite with us yet. Are there any further questions to this witness? If not, Mr. Whitehouse, can I thank you very much indeed for your contribution? We're most grateful to you.
Well, it's up to you, but I think we've got a good 15 minutes.
Right. Yeah, okay. Well, whenever we can.
It's annoying he came and I was slightly distracted.
Next witness. I apologise to the committee and indeed to the witness when he arrives. It's going to be messy because, unfortunately, the division will come in the middle of an evidence session, but it's unavoidable, I'm afraid.
And sort of what happens at that point? Do we come back?
Yes, we do.
And there's injury time as well.
I don't know if you heard that, Mr. Prendergast. We are likely to have a division in the House, so I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you if you've got the time to allow us to go and vote and come back if we haven't finished your evidence session before we start. You're most kind. Well, with that in mind, we'll now hear oral evidence from Andy Prendergast, who's the National Secretary of the GMB. And for this session, in theory, we've got until 4:30 p.m, but we may be interrupted. Mr. Prendergast, could you, for the benefit of the record, identify yourself?
Yep, Andy Prendergast, National Secretary of the GMB Union.
Thank you very much indeed. Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and good afternoon, Mr. Prendergast. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us this afternoon. I was wondering, for the benefit of the committee, if you might be able to elaborate on the overarching view of the GMB, your members, on the establishment of Great British Energy and indeed on government energy policy overall.
Well, look, I mean, in terms of GB Energy, we see this as a long overdue, desperately needed step. As a country, and as someone who works for a union supporting tens of thousands of energy workers, tens of thousands of people who work in the energy-intensive industries, there's a real problem at the moment whereby when we look across the world, we look at the investments being made in green technologies, we look at what other governments are doing to ensure that those investments lead to jobs and supply chains in their nations. And what we see in Britain is just a complete failure to match that. So you look at IRA in America, you look at the European subsidies, and what we're doing as a union is regularly sitting down with investors who have shovel-ready projects which have the opportunity and the potential to transform huge swathes of Britain in areas we've called left behind or post-industrial or the Red Wall, and actually we simply can't get the support to get those through. You know, these investors are telling us that if they decide to put their site in Philadelphia, they get huge subsidies, they get tax breaks. If they decide to put it in Germany, they get in subsidies, they get in government support. And in Britain, there is simply a void. So we've talked a lot, and I've heard quite a lot of people talk about the important supply chains. I'll be honest, for my union, we don't necessarily see those to the same degree. You know, if you look at offshore wind, what you see is jackets that aren't made in Britain. You're looking at technology that's not made in Britain. You're looking at blades that aren't made in Britain. You know, we have huge swathes of the country where people are willing and able to work, and yet they're sitting there and watching this technology be imported in. In the case of the metal yard in Scotland, you know, a metal fabrication site which is currently sitting without work, and they are watching the wind turbines they could be building being put up in the sea in front of them. Now, we need to avoid that, and I think GB Energy is the first step to doing that, and it's a step, frankly, that should have been taken a long time ago.
I mean, on the case of the metal yard in Scotland, I think Burnt Island we're speaking about, the UK government and I think the Scottish government did attempt to save that yard and ensure work moving forward. I don't quite know how GB Energy would have been able to do much more in that regard, but I do take your point. We need to build up the domestic supply chain and ensure there are manufacturing jobs here. In terms of the aims and the objectives of this, do you think that they go wide enough? Do you think that there is a broad enough scope for the different technologies that they will have to invest in? We've heard the CCA. There are slight concerns that there might not be the scope for investment in carbon capture, for example, where a lot of new jobs are going to be created And presumably a lot of those will be members of the GMB.
Well, we fought for carbon capture to be included, and as far as we're concerned, having checked the wording, we think that that is covered. I think the issues we have in terms of the scope are, A, whether the funds are sufficient to back the ambition. And, you know, obviously pre the election we were talking 28 billion at one point. I think what we have is, there's a huge scale and a huge opportunity. And ultimately, we would like to see more money, but this is genuine, real money that wasn't there beforehand. So I think that that is a step in the right direction. And from a trade unionist point of view, you know, it's very frequent I'm arguing about a lack of money, which we do on a daily basis everywhere. So I think that is one concern. In terms of one of the other concerns we do have about the bill, and I think the bill itself addresses this as being an issue, which is the role between GB Energy and GB Nuclear. We desperately need new nuclear. We're waiting for the decision on Sizewell. We would like to see the decision on Wilver as well as SMRs. I think there is a genuine question as to SMRs, do they fit under the remit of GB Energy or do they fit under the remit of GB Nuclear? And that's an issue that needs to be resolved. You know, SMRs are another of those technologies. Very much British brains created it, but if we're not careful, we will see these supply chains go overseas. And this is an industry that's likely to be 180 billion within a decade. Now, the choices we have is either that supports British companies like Rolls-Royce, or, as with wind, we import this key technology, which should be, you know, supporting communities and jobs throughout Britain.
More than 70,000 jobs actually created by SMR alone over the next few years if we get it right. Would you like to see clarification of that relationship between Great British Nuclear in the bill, do you think?
I mean, I'm not necessarily saying it needs to be in the bill, but I think it needs to happen quite quickly. You know, the bill does refer to the fact that it needs to be sort of bottomed out. And as I said, you know, every route we look at to net zero requires a huge increase in the amount of nuclear power. We need that decision on Sizewell quite quickly. I don't look at that as key to be British Energy, but it is something that needs to be resolved.
Absolutely. FID by the end of the year would be great. Thank you very much. Mr. Roger.
Josh McGann.
Chair, and welcome Andy to the session. Thousands of your members at Sellafield are involved, I guess, at one end of the energy system, as doing brilliant work in the decommissioning field. And you've really touched on it, which is the relationship between GBN and GBE. The bill does have flexibility for future involvement with nuclear, and I imagine what the government have tried to do, and I think the bill does achieve, is get the relationship right so that GBN can continue with its programme of work without that being disrupted overtly, but open the door in the future for a bringing together of the two endeavours. Have GMB got views on how to best enable the multi-gigawatt scale programmes in the future, and reflections that you've got from the experience with GBN to date, which would inform the bill?
I mean, look, I think the most important thing to say in relation to nuclear is I think the nuclear industry in Britain is, to a certain degree, a tragedy. You know, this was something we invented. The first civil nuclear site in the world was British, and yet when we came to Hinkley Point, we had to import the know-how, import the technology, and reinvent the wheel. What we've done in Hinkley Point has been absolutely amazing. It's a site that employs tens of thousands of people. It's giving real skilled jobs. It's putting, you know, and the kind of jobs people are proud to do. And I think this is very important. If you look at what the lessons we've learned from Hinkley, I think if we transfer that to Sizewell, then actually we start speeding up the process. If we then go on to Wilver again, then that becomes easier to take it through. I think the key thing is what this shows is we can't have these huge gaps, because when there's the gaps, we lose the skills. And what's really frightening for us in so many areas, and we're talking about an energy transformation, we simply do not have the skills to transform in the speed we need to. You know, there's estimated to be a 40,000 lack of welders in this country. Now, at the moment, if you look in the near future, we're going to need more pylons, we're going to need a huge amount of work on the water mains, we're going to need SMRs, CCS, we're going to need hydrogen. And I was sitting on a load of government bodies with the last government, and frankly, all I kept hearing is we need more welders. And you had to sort of take a view that repeating we need more welders sadly does not magically lead to lots of welders showing up. We need the investment in the skills, we need the investment in the supply chain to make sure we're getting the right people in the right place. And what I would say with welding jobs, just importantly, these are fantastically well paid. These are jobs that get paid more than most people in the room. There shouldn't be a problem employing welders in this country if we simply resort to capitalism. So if there is a problem, how do we identify it and how do we get around that?
And Chair, I should have declared an interest, I think, at the start of that question as the Chair of the Nuclear Energy APPG.
Thank you. That is a matter of record, and can I gently advise any other members that have a similar interest to declare their interest? Vera Hophouse.
Thank you, Chair. So, and it's good to hear you again, Andy. We had a discussion a few weeks ago. You have been saying at the very beginning of your remarks today, and other people today have also said that GB Energy should not just be an investment vehicle, it should be so much more. We have to deal with the bill here and to see whether the bill will do that. The ambitions, for example, of your members, that GB Energy is more than just an investment vehicle. Is there anywhere in the bill where you think there's a gap where this could be emphasised in order to make sure that GB Energy just does not become just an investment vehicle?
I think a lot of the conversations we've had when we're talking about the one-stop shop, when we're talking about the assistance in planning, in further regulatory support, I think there's something that's going to evolve over a period of time. That's also going to be matched by the funding. I think on its own, an investment vehicle is badly needed because at the moment it's something we do not have, and that's almost unique amongst advanced economies. But when you look at the bill itself, I think there's parts on it that could be fleshed out. I mean, our view is we'd like to see more about skills, as I just mentioned. I think there's some parts of that we need to look at. But at the same point, I think this is very much an evolutionary process as opposed to something we definitely need in the bill at the moment.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Andy. You've spoken very clearly up till now. If I picked you up correctly, you've expressed a modicum of concern around the quantum, which runs alongside the bill to support its potential strategic investments. If you could perhaps elaborate upon that a little bit more. But secondly, to that, I think Section 3.2c with regards to energy efficiency, are GMB of the view that GB Energy is going to bring down energy bills?
I'm going to think in terms of the second part first. One of the key things that the public want is the public want to see lower energy bills. We know that, and I think one of the issues we potentially had with GB Energy being so popular, to a degree, is not everyone knew what it was. And I think some people mean that this is going to lead to an immediate reduction in energy bills. I think what we're likely to see is that over a longer period of time. What this needs to do is it needs to make the investments in new technologies which we have failed to do, and too often we've missed the boat over. So if you compare us to Denmark, for example, 14% of their exports are in green technology. That's because they have Ørsted, which is very similar to what we're trying to do with GB Energy. But ultimately, they've had a long run into this, and they've stolen a march. What GB Energy belatedly allows us to do is potentially steal a march on some of the new technologies that haven't been exploited, with a view of us supporting those supply chains in the important parts. Can you just repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, just in relation, if that's okay to yourself, Chair, just in relation to the quantum that's available. You made reference to IR, you made reference to the EU's corresponding investment. The quantum that sits around GB Energy is 8.3 over the course of 5 years, 1.6 per year. Do you think that's sufficient in order to meet the objectives that are laid out in the bill?
I think it's sufficient to make some of them, and I think it's sufficient to make a difference. It is not sufficient to make as much of a difference as we would like it to do, but compared to what we've had beforehand, it's light years ahead of where we've been.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask really about two things. The first is whether you feel that under Objects 2D, that measures for ensuring security of the supply of energy, how important is that to have in there for your members, given the kind of global situation we find ourselves in, and also which of the objects will have the most impact, or in what ways will this bill have impact on your members, essentially?
Well, the first point around supply of energy, this was really brought home around the start of the Ukraine war, when it was just exposed as to how unprepared we were. Whereas your average European country had months of gas supplies, we had a matter of weeks. We went into that war with the largest gas supply place in the world, rough, unused. And I think one of the things we have to understand with the evolving nature of government is what is the very minimum that we expect government to do. And I think the very minimum people expect government to do at the moment is keep the lights on and keep us secure. That is how important energy is. And I know sometimes speaking to some politicians, there's almost a view that energy is some kind of optional extra. I don't think that's been the case for about 150 years, and God forbid we go back to that. So I think when we're talking about energy and energy supply and security, what this is about two things. It's about...
Order. Division on the floor of the House. I'm suspending the committee until 4:35. Order. By my clock, 25 to 4 is 4:35. 25 to 5 is 4:35, which is when we said we'd start again. And we're quorate. Mr. Prendergast, I'm sorry you were interrupted. It's been very good of you to stay. And I believe I'm right in saying that Ms. Blake had a second question. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, the second question really was, before we were interrupted, really what the biggest impact of this bill will be on your members. I don't think we've covered that.
I think both in terms of shoring up the jobs we currently have and potentially creating the jobs that we so desperately need. One of the real concerns we have about net zero is the way that for a lot of countries there is a perception that net zero is something that's being done to people, not with them. And I think if you look at the response in America, which is very much typified by drill baby drill, if you look at Germany, where bizarrely the Alternative for Deutschland are organising around heat pumps, what we've recognised, and we've already got Reform UK talking about fighting the next election on the basis of net zero, we have to make net zero work for people. And personally, we think the best way of making net zero work for people is to make sure that it comes with jobs, it comes with opportunities. And the simple reality is that those jobs and opportunities, if we get it right, are going to be in the kind of post-industrial areas. We've seen the maps put forward by people in the hydrogen lobby, from the carbon capture and storage. These are jobs in places that desperately need them. And if we're going to be serious about levelling up and making sure prosperity is sped in Britain, we need to rebuild these industrial heartlands with proper, decent technologies that we can start exporting.
Thank you, Chair. My question was going to be very simply, it's good to have you, Martin. In terms of the bill and its priorities, do you think there should be anything within that around workforce and workforce development? My experience, having worked in the sector alongside GMB colleagues, is lots of these new companies set up but don't recognise trade unions and don't have the quality of work that we've seen in the already power and industry section, particularly in renewables and others. Indeed, some of the renewables companies, which are divisions of existing larger companies which do recognise their unions, have set up without recognition. What role do you think within this bill is, or the strategic priorities, to ensure we get the right terms and conditions for the new workforce as we have for existing workforces?
That's a very good question, and what we've been really pleased to see is the fact that the role of trade unions is incorporated in the bill. We need to flesh out exactly how that works, but I think your criticism of the renewables industry, particularly for members of people who join the GMB, is absolutely critical. Because when people talk about a lot of our role in industry, what they're talking about is the white-collar jobs. They're talking about the ones in universities of getting the technology. They're not talking about the blue-collar jobs. And the blue-collar jobs are ones that at the moment, when you look at the energy sector, it's very well unionised, it has good rates of pay, it has excellent terms and conditions, and it gives the security that both families and communities need for the long term. And what really concerns us about the renewables industry so far is that it came with promise of mass jobs that simply haven't materialised. So Alex Salmond promised 30,000 jobs in offshore wind. 10 years later, less than 10,000 have been delivered, particularly when you're looking at a lot of the maintenance jobs. You're talking about subcontracted with terrible terms and conditions, anti-union. Now, when we look at the success that a place like America have had in renewables, when you look at the success that Europe have had in renewables, it has trade unions at the heart of that. And I think what we've seen so far is a real willingness of both the government to work with both ourselves and employers. And one of the bizarre things about it is those coalitions really have an impact. One of the most surprising days of getting my job was actually attending a meeting here and being praised by a Tory MP, which I never actually thought would happen and was one of those pinch yourself moments. But it was in relation to Hinkley Point, and it was recognised that we had a huge role in there in helping develop the workforce, in helping to manage that process of making sure they benefited, and also we got things done quickly and properly. So I think if we get that right, then this is an opportunity not just to bring jobs, but bring good jobs. And if you look at, a lot of the areas we're talking about, and we have this constant debate about red wall, about post-industrial, it's not that there's no jobs there. It's just the jobs that are being brought in are not very good ones. They're not jobs that offer permanent contracts. They're not jobs that offer good pensions, sick pay, opportunities to advancement. They're 0 hours contracts, got here today, gone tomorrow, that actually give people very little pride. This is an opportunity to reverse that 40-year decline in our industrial base and actually do something positive about it.
Uma Kumar.
And I'll declare I'm a proud member of the GMB. Thanks, Andy. The transition is one that we all care about, and it needs to be a just transition, one that takes local communities with us. In your opinion, what more can the government do to ensure that workers and jobs are kept at the heart of the GB Energy Bill?
I think there is a part of this which is about listening and listening without prejudice. And one example of that, and look, we're going to be absolutely clear, we agree with a Labour government on a huge wave of things. One thing we don't agree on is the ending of oil and gas licences. We look at oil and gas licences. Every single scenario into the future requires us to have oil and gas. We as a nation have a choice. We either take it for ourselves with high worker standards, high environmental standards, or we import it from a number of, frankly, disreputable regimes. And I think part of that transition has to listen to those communities, listen to the people doing the jobs, and actually take their expertise. Now, we're absolutely clear, and I think it's obvious to anyone with half a brain, that, frankly, global warming is happening, and the speed at which it's happening is quicker. It is the biggest challenge humanity has faced, certainly in my lifetime, and we need to deal with it. The concern for us, and it relates to what I was talking about earlier, is if we get this wrong, if we don't listen to communities, if we don't bring communities with us, then we risk getting a reaction against that, which is what we've seen in America, which is what we've seen in Europe, where instead of doing it a little bit slower but in a demonstrable and deliverable way, we ultimately end up with an electorate who are being offered simple solutions, are being offered quick fixes, and ultimately they, as a mixture of climate pessimism and snake oil salesmen, they take the wrong decision. So I think we have to look at some of this from a pragmatic angle, ask what's best in the national interest, and listen to the workers and communities who are currently benefiting.
Baron Moon.
My question's been answered, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Torkel Crichton.
Thank you, Andy, for your impressive evidence, and can I declare I'm a member of the GMB as well, Chair? You welcome the bill, and it possibly is the prescription pad for renewables, but what would you write on that prescription pad to make sure the workforce is involved and we retain that workforce as we move to green energy away from oil and gas?
I think the role of trade unions is key. It's about, I've always had a very simple view. Trade unions are about democracy at work. We are a country who believe in democracy so much we invade other countries to give it to them whether they want it or not. And yet the idea of democratisation of the workplace is an anathema to certainly, what was over half of Parliament. Now, we need to listen to workers. We need to make sure workers share in the success of businesses, and ultimately that their sacrifices and those of their families are recognised. Now, when you look at the work that's going to be coming out, we notice we have to do this. We've been asking for industrial plan for years, and I think GB Energy is part of that industrial plan. And that industrial plan has to be a roadmap of how we do this possibly, how we engage those communities, and how we provide the support necessary to make a transition. And earlier I referenced going to Denmark, and when I was in Denmark something quite fascinating happened, that they closed a bacon plant. 1,000 jobs. And you sit there and go, that's terrible. In Britain, we'd be fighting that. We'd be on picket lines. In Denmark, because of the support given in terms of social security, because of the support given in retraining, because of an industrial strategy, this was actually looked at as an opportunity. It was an opportunity for people to get better jobs. And it was also helped an awful lot by the fact that they were getting 90% of their salary paid for up to a year. So I think people thought, well, it's a better job and a little bit of a holiday in the meantime. But that shows what happens when you engage people properly. And therefore what you ended up with was something that would decimate a community in Britain, rejuvenating a community in Denmark. And that's because there was this tripartite strategy of listening to unions, of talking to government, of talking to employers, and actually everyone putting their heads together to come up with a solution to what would clearly be a problem. That's what we failed at in Britain for years.
Mr. Prendergast, thank you indeed for your patience. and for answering the questions that you have taken this afternoon. The committee's indebted to you. I'm most grateful. Now, if the Minister leading on the bill would like to metamorphose himself and take the witness stand. So we'll now hear oral evidence from Michael Shanks, Member of Parliament, Minister for Energy at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And for this session, we think we have until about 5:05. And Mr. Shanks, could I ask you, for the benefit of the record, to identify yourself?
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Shanks. I'm the Minister for Energy.
Thank you. Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. Good afternoon, Minister. We've not seen enough of each other today, obviously, so far. When you were introducing this bill on the floor of the House, you said, and I quote, on the 26th of July, there will be a range of projects in some of which we will certainly have the controlling stake and some of which we might help to get over the line. But in every single project, there will be a return for the British taxpayer. Already today, we talked about how GB Energy will be important and almost the key partner in investing in those riskier elements, riskier technologies. How can you guarantee that every single project will have a return?
Well, I think what's important to say is that the return for the taxpayer will take different forms. So we've been really clear in all of the briefings that we've done on the bill and indeed in the founding statement that in some we'll take an equity stake, in some it will be debt financing, in others it might be actually we're providing some of the capacity for organisations to take forward some of that funding themselves or some of the project delivery themselves. And in each one of those, we expect GB Energy will play a part in delivering those projects, getting them over the line, delivering for the British people. Now, that will be in a variety of different ways. Some of it will absolutely be money coming back to GB Energy, which we have said will either be further invested in more projects or give a return to the Treasury to fund in different ways public services. But it might also be making sure that, for example, in community energy, we are helping those community projects to get up and running. That's also delivering a return for those communities.
See why, thank you very much, Roger. You can see why the interpretation of what you said might lend itself to the understanding that what you meant was return to the taxpayer of a monetary value from every single project that was being invested in. Are you clarifying that today? You're not standing by that statement anymore?
Well, I'm saying very clearly the aim of setting up GB Energy is that, like other countries right across the world, we can have a stake in some of the projects that we're delivering. That's quite normal in many European countries. And indeed, in the previous government, they found it very acceptable for those projects to set up in the UK as well. It's just they didn't want the UK to have a stake in any publicly owned energy. So it's a very common method of delivering projects like this and giving a return to the British taxpayer. That's important. Now, it will take many different forms. In time, there will absolutely be a significant financial return on many of these projects. But in some of them, as you rightly say, de-risking those projects, getting them over the line, it will involve us taking a strategy where on individual projects we might not make an immediate return. But the overall vision of GB Energy is that it plays a part in helping us achieve our targets by 2030 and having the British public have a stake in that future. That's something we believe in, and we would hope that all members of Parliament would support.
The context of the bill, the objects, financial assistance, the strategic priorities and plans, it's quite clear that you are seeking to develop a company in the mould of an Ørsted or an EDF. You just quoted yourself there a target of 2030 decarbonisation of the grid. It's going to take, and some of the other witnesses here today have said it will take 10, 15 years and many billions of pounds more than what is already being allocated to GBN to even begin to compete with an EDF or an Ørsted. So how on earth will this company actually assist on that journey to 2030 decarbonisation if it will take as long as some of the other witnesses have said to begin to compete?
Well, I think there's two different questions there, Mr. Bowie. I think absolutely we are saying if you look at the rest of Europe, there are fantastic companies, EDF, Ørsted, Statkraft, that are delivering many of these projects in the UK. It is a model that clearly works, that delivers economic and social benefits to those countries, to the people living in those countries. If we look at the price spike when Ukraine was invaded, EDF was able to mitigate some of that significant rise in bills for people in France. Now, we're not saying that within 6 months of setting up GB Energy it's going to compete with Equinor or Ørsted. Of course we're not. But it is important that we start that journey. And of course all of these publicly owned companies started somewhere. They have been able to invest in the future to get to the scale that they are now and to deliver significant projects in the process. I think the second point of your question I think is important, that look, GB Energy is not designed to displace any of those companies or any other companies, incidentally, in delivering projects in the UK. It is about crowding in additional investment. And we know that, look, 2030 is going to be a real challenge. We've been very clear that we've set a target that we think is extremely ambitious but achievable. And the NISO, when they publish their roadmap very shortly, will give the detail on how we're going to get there. But we have to start somewhere. And I think GB Energy is a critical part in delivering that and will play a significant role in getting us to 2030 and, crucially, beyond 2030.
You're absolutely right in what you say. Some of these companies, EDF, Ørsted, Equinor, Vattenfall, are fantastic companies, but it should be noted also that EDF, whilst, yes, returning for the French taxpayer, also was bailed out by the French government to the tune of about 20 billion euros last year. I do hope we don't get into a similar situation with GB Energy. Moving on, there's been some concern raised today that there is not very much clarification or some confusion over and around the status of Great British Nuclear within GB Energy, the operational independence of it, the autonomy. I wonder if you might expand on it and maybe think about including something in the bill regarding Great British Nuclear and its relationship with Great British Energy.
It's a really important question, and I think we have said throughout that we want to have further discussions about the role of Great British Nuclear. I think folding it into Great British Energy probably is not the right solution, because I think what's really important about, and credit to your government for doing this, is that the board of Great British Nuclear has a significant expertise in nuclear projects, and I think that is important for us to maintain. We will look at, clearly there will be synergies and there will be work together on certain projects, but I think they do have in some ways quite different remits in terms of the investments we expect them to make, and so I think they probably will remain in some form independent of each other, but clearly the partnership working between them will be important, and we'll say more on that in the coming months.
Thank you very much. That's my last question. Thank you. I agree with you entirely in what you said about Great British Nuclear, and Sir Roger, I think we should note that the Minister actually just credited the former government with something, which I think is
I think I credited you earlier as well. This is becoming a habit.
My very last question, Sir Roger, you'll be pleased to hear. Earlier on, Jürgen Meyer, the chair of GB Energy, committed the headquarters in Aberdeen to employing in the region of hundreds, but he did say over 1,000 people in time. Will you be drawing any specific numbers of people that will be based at the headquarters in Aberdeen?
No, I won't be, and I think, to be fair to Jürgen Meyer, what he said very clearly was that in the initial set-up phase and for some time afterwards, we're talking employees in the hundreds based in the headquarters. Eventually, we think it might expand beyond that in Aberdeen and in the satellite offices, and indeed in any other setups that we have across the UK. But I think the critical point on jobs is that the role of GB Energy is to invest in projects where we are creating new, well-paid, trade unionised jobs in the UK. That's critical. And so the jobs aren't necessarily going to be in the headquarters of GB Energy, but they will be created by GB Energy's investment. That's where the thousands, tens of thousands of jobs right across the UK will come from.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Sir Roger.
Well, I understand this morning that was out of order, but you got your answer in the end. Perrin Moon.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair, I'd just like to also declare that I am the Secretary of the Critical Minerals APPG, and I'll be relevant to my question. Minister, thank you very much. So the people of Cornwall, I think I can quite safely say, are really excited about GB Energy. Expectations are very high. We are a post-industrial community that suffered for decades with a lack of investment. But more recently, we have discovered that there is now investment going into our tin industry. We've got the third highest grade tin deposits in the world, lithium. We faced the Celtic Sea, so we've got a huge opportunity with offshore wind, onshore wind. We've got companies setting up in geothermal, solar, tidal. We've got the UK's largest ground source heat pump. The country's largest ground source heat pump. Can you elaborate on the potential benefits for communities like Cornwall where we have such a wide array of opportunity, how GB Energy is going to support them. And if I may be a little bit cheeky, we have heard quite a lot today about the head office being set up in Aberdeen and satellite offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's another corner of the United Kingdom that would be delighted to have a satellite.
Well, can I thank you for the question? I think you have successfully elaborated on all of the potentials of Cornwall yourself in that question, and I'm sure your constituents will be delighted to see all of that. But you raise a really important point on two fronts. I think the aim of GB Energy is to crowd in investment in projects right across the United Kingdom. So yes, the headquarters, we are very proud to say it will be in Scotland. And importantly, the Prime Minister announced in Aberdeen. And that's partly to recognise the energy story in the northeast of Scotland for the last 60 years in oil and gas, the importance of the transition. But it's also important to say that on the renewables journey, Scotland has also been leading the way and will continue to do in so many ways. So it was right that the headquarters was there, building on the talent and experiences and skills that are in Aberdeen. I think on the broader point, though, there are real opportunities for investments in every corner of the UK. And to go back to some of the earlier points that witnesses raised, look, this is a combination of policies. It's not just GB Energy in isolation. We've been really clear that we're a government that's not agnostic about industrial strategy, that we want to see manufacturing in the UK, that we want to see the thousands of jobs that could have been created by some of our offshore wind projects, for example, but actually went to other countries and we towed them into British waters. We want to see those jobs in this country, and that will create opportunities right across the country in the supply chains, in skill development, and in lots of other opportunities in Cornwall as well. So although I absolutely can't commit to opening an office in Cornwall, and I'd like the record to reflect that, I think there will be opportunities for your part of the world and for the whole of the UK.
Eric Cross.
We've heard from various of the witnesses, in particular from Ravi Gurumurthy, about the risk management of private investment and how that will sort of coincide within GB Energy. And I'm just wondering, how will the bill, or how is it expected to ensure that GB Energy doesn't just effectively end up as a sink for risky investments, and or is that okay? Like, is that sort of the prospect of GB Energy, is that it does provide that full buffer? And if not, how are we going to prevent this? Because otherwise, we're effectively just putting taxpayers' money as the risk management for private risk management. And it's just, I mean, I don't think there's definitely, I don't have a yes or no what side of that fence I sit on. I'm just wondering what actually within the concept of the bill is acceptable.
I think it's a really fair question, and I think the question of risk appetite is important. It's partly why setting up GB Energy as a company regulated by the Companies Act and having a fiduciary board that are financial experts that have a responsibility as a board of directors for the direction of the company and for the financial results of the company is so important. I think there has to be some risk appetite, because I think one of the witnesses earlier made the point that I would agree with, that actually if there are absolutely no projects that don't have any risk at all, and GB Energy is not really filling the gaps. So it is really important that GB Energy can move in the spaces where the current investors aren't necessarily finding those opportunities. But crucially, it's owned by the taxpayer, and therefore, as a backstop, there is that real conviction that it will only invest in things that have got a likelihood that there'll be a return to the taxpayer. And of course, I think when we get into individual decisions on these, it's partly why I think it's important the bill doesn't go into a granular level of detail on every single possible thing that GB Energy will do, because it is really important that we give that board and those experts and everyone that they bring in to advise them the space to move into opportunities as they emerge. And I think if we were to go back 5 or 10 years, we wouldn't be thinking that we were about to have the world's biggest floating offshore wind farm off the coast of the UK. That wouldn't be in the face of a bill like this, but actually it's a huge potential opportunity for us. We would like those kind of opportunities to be open to GB Energy to explore.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Roger. Obviously, if we're going to learn the lessons of coal and the 1980s, South Yorkshire would be a perfect location for a satellite office, so just put that on your agenda, Minister.
We've had this from every Scottish MP for the last 6 months.
We haven't had enough about God's own country here today, so county even. There's been a lot of positivity today from witnesses, and actually some of them seem quite excited about this. So I wanted to understand from your perspective why it's taken a change of government to see this sort of bill come forward, and what your kind of ambition is for the bill.
That's really important. And, you know, last week I visited Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station, the last coal-powered power station in the UK, and it was a good example, actually, of the just transition in practice. It was the right thing that we phased out coal, but the TUC themselves confirmed that actually it was exactly how you deal with workers in a really difficult situation like that, where you're moving people from one industry, transitioning them into something else. And it was a properly planned process, and that's what we want to see in industry. Because you're right, we absolutely want to avoid what happened in coal mining in the 1980s. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that this government isn't agnostic around the future of jobs and manufacturing in our industrial communities right across the country. It is important that we invest in those, not only because, frankly, we're in a race against the world for all the parts that we need to deliver this energy future, and we're going to need to produce some of it in this country, but also because good, well-paid, skilled jobs are how we manage the transition in a fair and prosperous way. So it's critical for us. I think it matches in with other policies. So yes, GB Energy will be a key part of this. The industrial strategy, it will be important. The National Wealth Fund will be important. And a whole range of levers, the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, is all about saying, as a government, we are committed to the future of this workforce and to creating tens of thousands of new jobs that don't currently exist.
Thank you, Sir Roger. We've heard a lot of evidence from a lot of people today with a lot of hopes, but also understood that it could, in the end, this bill could be all things to all people. I understand that it's not great to put too much detail on it, but I worry a little bit that it is very general and that we end up with nobody being quite clear what GB Energy is ultimately for. So if we are not putting more detail into it, but EDF, for example, because the witness came from a country with different culture of ownership, for example, talked about public ownership. So is ultimately something like GB Energy, if we're going very wide, a vehicle to create more public ownership? And in that context, are we talking just about energy, a community energy? And we obviously understand that community energy projects are then some form of public ownership. Or are we talking about a completely different ownership landscape, ultimately, that we will see in the future?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, and I would urge you to read the Great British Energy founding statement document alongside the bill, because it is important. The bill is about setting up a company, and what we don't want to do is hamstring that company by putting so much detail into it that actually it can't move into the right places that give good investment opportunities for the taxpayer and deliver good energy projects. But the statement makes very, very clear on community energy, for example, it's a key part of our local power plan. We want to see much more community-owned energy projects. For a combination of reasons, there's real social and economic benefits for communities of those projects. For us, there is just a belief that actually communities having a stake in these projects is important, and it helps us with some of the arguments for the amount of infrastructure that we're going to have to build in the next few years, that actually if communities have ownership of that, they feel part of that mission. But also there are issues in certain parts where we want small-scale generation projects to have access to connections that bigger projects can't, and frankly, in a lot of cases, building the power generation near where the population is, where at the moment we've got issues with the spatial energy planning across the country. So there are huge opportunities. We're committed to increasing community ownership. I think we've also said in the local power plan, though, that it could look like municipal ownership of certain generation projects. It could look like local authorities, combined authorities. We're quite open about what that looks like, but we want to create a landscape where Great British Energy can invest, but also provide some of the capacity to help organisations get over the line, because we all know local government is struggling. It's on its knees right across the country after years of underfunding. The capacity to deliver a lot of these projects isn't there. GB Energy can fill that gap.
Try and get everybody in, but we're playing beat the clock a bit. Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to draw our attention to section 5.5, which is around consulting Welsh ministers. for areas that are within the legislative competence of the Senedd, and I just wanted to ask whether, I'm really pleased to see that in there, obviously, and that Welsh Government will be consulted, and I wondered if you've had any intergovernmental collaboration so far to help inform the bill.
Yes, a really important question, and there's a number of different things we've been doing already. So I've had many conversations with my counterparts in the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government, and to a different degree in the Northern Irish Executive, because of course energy is transferred in Northern Ireland, but we are keen that they are still part of the bill so that they can still benefit from some of the GB Energy possibilities, but of course it will be a different relationship because they're part of a different grid. But in all my conversations with the Scottish Government and with the Welsh Government, it has been about how we collaborate, not just on the formal process of consulting on the statement of priorities, but actually how they can be part of helping GB Energy set its priorities on an ongoing basis. So on Monday I met with the Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government and we talked about, for example, the Scottish Government having a role in a much wider sense in the company, helping with some of the priorities in Scotland, or there's a variety of different ways. I think what's critical about this is absolutely the devolved administration should be consulted, and we want that to be an open process. But we have also reset the relationships with the devolved administrations in a way that actually this isn't a combative process now. We have across the UK broadly the same outcomes in mind around clean power, slightly different targets here and there, but we all are on the same journey. And that allows us to align a lot of our priorities and really deliver for people all across the UK. I want that to be an open and collaborative approach. Consultation is the formal part, but it's not the limit of what we think can happen.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your candour so far. Section 3.2c of the bill refers to energy efficiency. Can you clarify to the committee when GB Energy will reduce energy bills by £300?
Well, we committed in the election that bills would come down. That figure was from independent analysts. We never said that overnight bills would come down. This is a process that will take time. GB Energy is part of delivering that. Without GB Energy, it will be harder to reach our targets by 2030 and to bring down bills for everyone, because the reality of bills is we remain far too wedded to fossil fuels. Whether those come from the North Sea or not, they're traded on the international market and we're subject to all of the spikes. So reducing our dependence on unabated gas is critical. And that's why I would hope that all members would vote to support GB Energy as part of the solution, including yourself.
Cameron.
Thank you, Minister. It's good to see the UK as a global leader once more being the first to end coal in the G7, but also ensuring, as you said, that the transition has been a just one. It's an increasingly perilous time globally to rely on foreign countries for our energy and energy security, and it remains a concern for us. So just looking at Object 2D on measures for ensuring the security of the supply of energy, for our constituents watching at home, which I choose to believe they are, what does this actually what does this bill actually mean for energy security? What does this mean for our constituents for the years ahead?
Well, I mean, of course, our constituents and the wider population are watching every moment of this hearing, I have no doubt. I think it's a really important question. That security of supply question is part of the really critical questions we've got to answer. We've got this, at the moment, challenge of how do we bring down bills, how do we move towards our climate targets for clean power, which is essential, and also how do we ensure security of supply. The only way, the only long-term solution to that is for us to move to cheaper renewable energy at pace. Every single year that we are dependent on volatile fossil fuel markets, we open ourselves up to the kind of exposure that people are still paying the price for in the last few years. That can't continue. Now, we're not going to be able to flick a switch overnight. We've come in after 14 years of chaos, frankly, in so much of government, and we're doing as much as we can to move at pace. But this is the journey that we need to be on. And 2030, as I've said, is ambitious, but it's absolutely achievable. And I was heartened by, I think, every single one of our witnesses today confirmed that although this is an ambitious programme, they see GB Energy as a really critical part of that. Not the silver bullet, of course it's not, and we've never said it is, but it is a critical part in moving us towards energy security, cheaper bills, and the climate leadership that the public want.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up again on what I think I'd like to understand whether you see this as the missing limb in Clause 3 and the objects. So I did hear you in the Chamber mention that the fifth objective of GB Energy is community energy. And so we are missing the fifth objective in Clause 3 around community energy. And I've heard from witnesses, I think we all have, all of the witnesses today have had how crucial this community piece is, both into de-risking, reducing the delay. I just wonder whether you would be open to the amendment that's being tabled to consider putting it in here, even though we're looking at, I don't think this would make it more difficult to hold the flexible, wide-ranging framework that we've had. So it's seeing if you're open. Thank you.
So I think there are two separate things here. There's the objects in the bill, which is around the restrictions that are placed on Great British Energy, and then there's the 5 key functions which are outlined in the founding statement. So I think what I was referring to in that was the 5 key functions, one of which is the local power plan, which is how we think we'll deliver a lot more community-owned energy. I think the really important thing about the bill is what we don't want to do is inadvertently create a list of things that we think are good things to have, and I don't disagree with you at all on the importance of that, but actually end up restricting it in ways that we don't expect to. And I think the danger with bills like this, and it was the same with Great British Nuclear, it was the same with the UK Investment Bank, it has a very clear, focused remit. The objects, there's nothing in the objects that prevent community energy projects. In fact, they are intrinsic in several of them. But we think adding more and more detail to this, including the amendment that you're proposing, isn't the right way to go. But it's really clear in the founding statement, in the evidence from Jürgen Meyer, in numerous answers from myself and from the Secretary of State, that it's something we're absolutely committed to.
Finally, with 2 minutes left, Torquil Crichton.
Thank you, Minister, for your assurances there on GB Energy's, the bill's commitment and your own commitment to investment in community energy schemes and municipal schemes, and what we've heard from witnesses, industry witnesses today, about communities taking a stake in their own projects, and for not having an industrial strategy that's agnostic. And that obviously means giving priority to communities, giving priority to community projects onto grid connections, and making sure that they get all the help they can to bring their projects to fruition. Can you clarify how GB Energy might help with that?
Yeah, really importantly, and I think there's two different strands to this. I think there's the capacity building point, which you allude to, which is critical. There's a lot of communities that absolutely have the possibility, the option, the potential for some of these projects, but just don't have the capacity to deliver them. We see that as a really critical role that GB Energy can have as a sort of one-stop shop of experts that can be used to provide that support, to help with some of the pre-planning work that's essential, to help them navigate the connections issues. I think the second point around connections is really important, and it's something I'm focusing a lot of time on in the wider remit that I've got as Minister, which is how do we clear the connections queue but also prioritise the projects that we want to get connected much faster. Now, some of that will require us to simply build more network infrastructure to alleviate the pressures. Some of it is building on the work the previous government did around prioritising the queue. There are difficult trade-offs. Far be it for me to give credit to the former minister again there. But there are trade-offs, because it is important for us not to say that one project is more valuable than the other. There might be, for example, mechanisms around saying one is more likely to be connected faster, or it's further through its delivery phase and therefore should get priority over something else. And there are also a lot of projects still in the queue that just shouldn't be there at all, because they're nowhere near ready to be delivered. So I think it's really important that we work on both of those things. But GB Energy, I think, can be a real catalyst for communities to unleash the potential that they have. And I'm really excited about the opportunities that are there. And if I might say, Sir Roger, just in closing, can I thank the committee members for their forbearance throughout today? And can I also say that it's the first time since 2010 that a minister's given evidence in a bill committee, and I'm glad that this Labour government has brought back the practice of government ministers being responsible to Parliament and answering these questions. I look forward to doing that more in the future.
Order. Can I thank the witness for their evidence, which brings to a conclusion the oral evidence on the bill. Committee will meet on Thursday morning in Committee Room 10 to begin line by line scrutiny of the bill. Government whip to move the adjournment.
That further consideration of the bill be adjourned.
The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye, contrary no, the ayes have it. Order, order.